Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Luke, and this is our very first lecture in our Perspectives in Development lecture series. Also, we're Development Economics Club, we're DevEc, if you guys didn't already know that. So thank you very much for coming. Today, I'm very excited to introduce you to our professor, Amartya Lahiri. If you guys haven't taken his classes before, he's really amazing at teaching. He's very good at making complex topics simple. And of course, he's here to share his research on rural and urban disparities in China and India. So without further ado, thank you very much for coming. And take it away, Professor Lahiri.
Thanks. Okay, so I think I'm going to try to straddle a middle ground between a technical talk and a sort of a broad overview talk, just so I don't lose too many people or doesn't make it sound completely trivial. So it's like, So anyway, so this is joint work with another professor here, Victoria Markowska, and an PhD student here who's now at SFU, Sev, who was who graduated some years back from here, but he's an amazing guy. Okay, so so I guess the way to introduce this is to really start by thinking about a well-known fact of development is that as countries develop, what happens is they start very rural, very agrarian, and they gradually become, the economy sort of moves away from agriculture, starts as development, picks up steam, economies become more non-agricultural. And in particular, they start becoming manufacturing, and then at some point they start transiting into services. So resources begin to flow out from agriculture towards the non-agricultural sectors of the economy. So that's kind of well known. It's called structural transformation of an economy, which is a key part of development. But along the way, as you can imagine, it has consequences because it involves resources moving out from not just one sector to another. So people have to switch sectors. That's clearly one of these things that if you were a farmer and now you have to figure out ways of being employed in a non-agricultural setting. So that involves changing occupations. And on top of that, you often have to change locations because the economy is sort of changing in a way that expanding sectors are in urban areas and contracting sectors are in rural areas. So effectively, if you are an agricultural worker, you not only do you have to possibly, you have to change occupations, but you also have to change locations often. Okay, so that's the other part. And so all of those things are expensive. It's not easy to figure out new ways of earning a living, and it's not easy to figure out where to go. I mean, if you have to change location. So those things are expensive. And so a key question in development, this is related to distributional consequences of development. That as economies grow and develop, does it cause rural workers, disproportionate losses? In some sense, who loses or who gains? Or are the gains aggregate gains for everybody? Or is it the case that rural workers tend to lose out, at least initially during the process? And so this has been, a key aspect of development and has worried policymakers for the longest time, which is why you have all kinds of rural development programs as being a sort of a standard fare in pretty much most developing countries, that policy interventions are, a lot of the time, are based on trying to provide some social insurance mechanisms for workers in rural areas, for agricultural workers, so in fact, one of the biggest public works programs that is there globally is in India. It's called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program, which is only for rural workers in India. And India has about, at the moment, close to about 500 to 600 million people in rural areas. So if you just lop that in half, that's the workforce. So 300 million workers approximately in rural areas, and they're all guaranteed 100 days work, employment. And that's purely because there's this massive concern that the process of development tends to favor urban workers against rural workers. So all these public policy schemes are about trying to provide insurance for rural workers. So that's the broad question. So clearly there seems to be some conviction in the minds of policymakers and indeed, commentators that development tends to affect, rural workers in possibly negative ways, that, in terms of distributional consequences, and which is why we need these policy interventions. So that's sort of the question that sort of, motivated us to look at this, to ask, what does the evidence tell us? Do rural workers lose or do they gain during this process of rapid structural, transformation and development in economies? So there's no better way to look at this data than to just start asking the question about what has happened to the two biggest economies that, in terms of people, China and India, since the 1980s. China started the whole development and structural transformation process back in the early 80s. India started, was very slow, but it's kind of picked up steam since the 1990s. So both these economies have been undergoing, pretty rapid structural transformation over the last 20, 30 years. There've been, there's been sharp growth in both these places. There's been a very stark increase in urbanization in both these places, where the urban workforce, the urban population has been rising disproportionately fast in both these countries. And we're talking about just the scale of this, the transformation and how many people it affects is just, it's huge. So we're talking about 1/5 of the world being affected by this, because that's the size of the rural population, when you combine together China and India, the rural workers, rural population, it's about 1.5 billion people. If you combine China and India, that's about 1/5 of the world. So it's a huge number that's being affected by this development process. So the scale of the transformation is massive. So the question about are they gaining, are they losing, what do we know, what does the data tell us? And that's really the first part of what I want to do. Ask this question about how have rural-urban income disparities evolved in China and India over the last 30, 35 years. And whatever the patterns are, can we explain them using just like, worker characteristics? Workers are working. Sometimes wages are changing simply because workers, relative wages are changing because one group of workers, education and, worker characteristics involve demographics, involve education, involve which occupations they're in. Maybe those are the things that can explain pretty much all that's going on. And so that's the question, the first question to ask is, can the observed changes in rural-urban income disparities or disparities between rural and urban workers, can we just explain them through pure worker characteristics? Things that the ability of workers as, measurable characteristics of workers, how many years of schooling they have, how much, what their demographic characteristics are, etc. And then what we'll see, and I'll show you the evidence, that it explains some of it, but a lot of the rural-urban changes in rural-urban disparities that we've been seeing, rural-urban income gaps, both in China and India, a lot of those changes over the last 30 years cannot be explained by what we observe in terms of worker characteristics. So there's a huge part that's left over. So there's a big residual, which is a puzzle. What exactly is accounting for the rest of it? And so that's where I'm going to sort of show you, we're going to develop a little model. I won't get into too many details on the model, but the exercise is going to be therefore to try and bring a little, a toy model in some sense to see if we can understand what else could be going on in this world. And the structural transformation is going to be a key player there. And then we're going to ask from the lens of that model, how much more can that model explain in terms of what the model is identifying as key drivers of rural-urban gaps? How much more beyond worker characteristics can we account for using basically the model? So let me actually start with the data, because that'll make life somewhat more stark. So we're going to look at micro-level data from India and China. For India, the data is going to be household surveys on various rounds going back to 1983. So this is individual rounds of household surveys at the unit level. So we have a lot of disaggregated micro data. And so, since we are interested in the fate of workers, people who are working, we're going to restrict the sample to individuals in the age group of 16 to 65 who are not enrolled in any educational institution. So, in other words, they are full-time members of the workforce, and for whom we have occupation and educational information. Because remember, we also want to sort of ask, when I see changes in wages of a worker, how much is that accounted for by simply how their educational and occupational decisions are changing, and how much is left over, in some sense, the residual. And so this is going to leave us with, per sample survey round, about 140 to 180,000 people. So it's a large, it's a very large sample of individuals. We're also going to look at, for China, we're going to look at primarily, we actually supplement this with other data sources from China as well, but our primary data source is going to be the China Household Income Project. It's called the CHIP data set, which is the one that is typically used for most researchers when they're starting to look at household developments in China. It's the CHIP that tends to be the basic source of data. And for these guys, we're going to look at 5 rounds of this CHIP household data from 1988 to 2008. India was 1983 to 2010. CHIP is, we are going to use 5 rounds. Actually, we are doing some new work where we extended this to 2015-16, and the pattern is pretty much the same. And once again, it's the same cut on the data because we are focusing on workers, so we need to look at people who are actually working, not students and so on, and who are in the working age group. So again, our data set's going to be 16 to 65-year-old people working full-time. Full-time in our definition is, in the Chinese thing, is going to be working more than 1,900 hours per year. And so the Chinese, the Household Income Project is a slightly smaller sample, so we have about 47 to 80,000 people per survey round. Okay, so that's the data. And so here is the main fact that I kind of, that caught our attention. So I'll start with India. In the left panel is the mean urban-rural wage gap. So the mean urban wage relative to the mean rural wage, it's the ratio. So clearly, if there are no urban-rural wage gaps, the height of the bar should be 1. So in 1988, on the left panel, the mean gap, as you can see, is about close to 60%. There's a 60% wage premium that urban workers, the mean urban wage is 60% higher than the mean rural wage in 1983. And then you cut ahead to 2010, you can see that's the red bar. It's, again, the same ratio of the mean urban wage to the mean rural wage in 1983, and in 2010, and that's dropped by about 35 percentage points. So that's convergence. The height of the red bar is lower than the height there is still an urban wage premium, but it's shrunk. So that's called a process of wage convergence seems to have kicked in. Urban-rural wage gaps are shrinking in India during this period. And it's not just about the mean. If you compute the median wage gap, you have the same phenomenon. The convergence is even sharper there. From the median wage premium was 80% in 1983, and it's down to 13%. So it's a much sharper gap, convergence in urban-rural wage gaps. So that's pretty striking because the prior most places is that this development process, is disproportionately biased against rural workers because they are the ones who have to bear all the costs in some sense. But that doesn't seem to be what's showing up in the Indian data, that rural workers have done better over the last 30 years compared to urban workers. Here's the corresponding data for China. And this is, once again, the urban wage premium is the left panel is the mean wage gap, the right panel is the median wage gap. And so it's pretty strong, but the wage gaps are, the urban wage premium is quite high. But what is striking is that between 1988 and 2008, the urban-rural wage gap has actually increased in China. Whether you're looking at the mean or whether you're looking at the median, wage inequality has increased. The urban-rural wage gaps have risen in China, while in India we saw they had been contracting. And so that's what was the source of This, in some sense, you might think is more standard, that's what the prior seems to be amongst policymakers, that's what you should see. In the Indian case, that's not what you see. You see a convergence happening. So anyway, the curiosity here is that these are two economies that are sort of going through a very similar transformation of their economies in terms of structural changes, and yet this key feature seems to be diametrically different. In one case, the inequality urban-rural wage gaps are widening. In China, in India, they seem to be contracting. You can look at this in, one initial instinct always is to suspect that, well, we picked up some sort of strange piece of the data. Maybe we should be, if we took a different cut on the data, it would be different. One possibility could be that, well, maybe we just picked up the end point. Maybe 2010 was a special year or something like that. But this is now plotting the mean gap and the median gap from 1983 in each round. And you can see there's a secular decrease in the wage gap, in the mean wage. It's not just about the last year of the survey that we did. It's just been falling, pretty much secularly throughout, whether we are talking about the mean or the median. And interestingly, one concern that sometimes, and you should have that, is that, well, maybe a lot of rural workers are not really wage workers. They operate their own little small pieces of land, so they're really self-employed people. So then it should show up in, so that's to control for that, because the wage data is not picking up for these self-employed farmers. You don't have any wages, but we do have household consumption. And you see exactly the same pattern in household consumption as well, that urban-rural household consumption gaps have also been shrinking during the same period, which is basically another way of checking for robustness, that is it just some anomaly based on the initial year, the last year? Is it some anomaly just based on wage data? And the answer is no. It seems to be a generalized shrinking of gaps. Economic inequality between urban and rural areas seems to have been shrinking in India during this period. In China, again, you do these robustness things, and you see exactly again, it's very robust, but it's going in the other direction. So this robustness is just looking at different sources of data. Okay, so not just the CHIP data, which is what we're looking at. The CHIP has monthly wages, it has annual wages. Doesn't matter what you look at, the wage gaps are widening, urban-rural wage gaps are increasing. You go to the statistical yearbook, which is a completely different data set, and that produces the same thing, widening wage gaps between, income gaps between urban and rural areas. And then you go to the China Health and Nutrition Survey, which is a bigger survey and is nationally representative, and that too has the same feature, that wage gaps, income gaps between urban and rural areas have been widening in China. So in India, they're shrinking. In China, they're expanding. Yet another way of checking for robustness is to ask, well, maybe it's like a couple of regions that are driving the whole thing. Okay, so there could be one or two big regions where all the action is, and everywhere else, maybe the patterns are very different. And so what we're doing here is we're looking at these urban-rural wage gaps, mean wage gaps in each state, between, how that has changed between 1983 and 2010 in India. It's the mean wage gap in each Indian state on the left panel. And in China, we're looking at Chinese provinces and asking the same question. And so what this is doing is, on the x-axis, it's plotting the urban-rural wage gap in 1983, the mean wage gap in 1983 in each of those states, and then recomputing the urban-rural wage gap for each of these states in 2010. And that red line is the 45-degree line. The 45-degree line has this nice property that the distance on the x-axis is exactly equal to the distance on the y-axis. So if you see a scatter of points which are all below the 45-degree line, that means the numbers on the x-axis exceed the numbers on the y-axis. That's exactly what you see for the Indian data. The urban-rural wage gaps in 1983 were larger across all Indian states relative to 2010. In China, it's the exact opposite. All the numbers are, for every province that we look at, the urban-rural wage gaps are greater in 2008 relative to 1983. And so that's the sense in which the urban-rural wage gaps have actually increased in China across all provinces, not just some large province driving it. It seems a generalized feature of the results. So the long and short of all of this is that the authors managed to convince themselves that there is something here which is not completely trivial to explain, in the sense that there has been a massive convergence of urban-rural wage gaps, or disappearing or contracting urban-rural wage gaps in India, which has also been happening across all states. It seems to be pretty robust. And in China, the pattern is the exact opposite. Urban-rural wage gap seem to have risen during this period. So then, of course, the next question to ask is, maybe this has something to do with worker characteristics changing very differently. Ultimately, what do our wages depend on? It depends on how educated we are, where we live, what age profile we are in, and so on. So all of those things drive are important contributors to our income. And so one can this is the standard thing one does in labor economics, that one tries to explain wages of workers by trying to understand what's happening to worker characteristics. And if stuff is left over, that's a puzzle. That, how much can you just purely explain? You should be able to explain most of it. So this is something that people often do when you're trying to, if you're trying to document signs of discrimination in the labor market. What you would do is say, for example, a gender wage gap. If you were trying to explain why do women, average mean wages of women are, 20% lower than male wages. One way to try to see is, well, if women are 20% less educated than men, then that would be one explanation. But if, all other worker characteristics, particularly education, age profile, and so on, once you control for all of that and you can't explain the wage gap, that is usually the way you interpret that as some sort of discrimination in the labor market. This is how people also go looking for discrimination between race-based wage gaps, black-white wage gaps, or all of those things. Is that a sign of discrimination or not? I mean, it's one way of looking at and so we kind of try to do the same thing over here by looking at worker characteristics and asking how much of relative changes in the worker characteristics amongst urban workers versus rural workers can account for these shrinking wage gaps in India. And it turns out that worker characteristics can account for maybe about 1/5 to 1/4 of the overall wage convergence, leaving 3/4 pretty much unexplained. So in other words, yes, it's true that rural workers' education, their age profiles have become more similar to urban workers, but that change can account for barely 1/5 of the overall change in the wage gap, or the convergence in the wage gap that we've seen. And so the remainder is a puzzle. There's been more wage convergence than can be explained by just purely worker characteristics. In China, in fact, what it says is that this minus 13% is interesting, because what that thing is saying is worker characteristics is basically trying, would predict that wage gaps should have converged in China, but they've actually widened, and that's why it's minus 13%. It's like it cannot explain, the worker characteristics want these wages to be actually become more similar, and in the data they've been widening, and that's the sense in which it's minus 13%. So the big question then is, what explains the rest of it? That's the puzzle that one would, we want to explain. I should say, there's always a sanity check in all of this, that the biggest thing we typically think of is what drives wages is education. And indeed, education, within the component that is being explained by worker characteristics, education is pretty much the biggest thing. So that's exactly what you would expect to see, but wages are moving way more than what these education markers are moving. Yeah?
I understand you're trying to get at characteristics, but there is a big outlier, right? I was wondering how come you never mentioned it.
Which outlier about?
One slide back, there's a really big outlier, right? So
Oh yeah, it's a very small state. I mean, it's not a big state. That's that outlier would actually predict divergence. So even though it's an outlier, it's not driving any of the convergence. What we would have had a problem if we had a whole bunch of observations above the 45-degree line, and you had one big guy below the 45-degree line, and that's the guy that's driving it. So this one's actually going the other way. Okay. Okay, so that sort of, since the worker characteristics isn't sort of helping us to understand, what's going on, we started looking at, country characteristics. What's been going on in China and India during this period. So these two countries have been remarkably similar in what they have been, experiencing over the last 30 years. These are both countries that have been, that have been experiencing major aggregate changes during the last 30, 40 years. In particular, the big one being the structural transformation of the economy. That's a shared characteristic. And so the way to see the structural transformation, the left panel is showing changes in the share of employment in agriculture and non-agriculture. We've collapsed sectors into agri and non-agri just to keep things simple. The left panel is across the years of our data, asking what fraction of workers are employed in agriculture. That's the blue, and the red is the remainder who are in non-agri. As you can see, over 60% were in agriculture in India back in 1983, and that number is now down to about 50%. So the employment shares have, moved away from agriculture towards non-agriculture in India. China is the same thing. Again, close to 60% back in 1988. It's come down. It's a sharper reduction in the share of workers in agriculture. But once again, the same pattern, that the blue bars are shrinking and the red bars are expanding. And that's structural transformation on the employment side, that fewer people are engaged in agriculture as a share of the workforce. You see a very similar pattern in the output shares as well. What fraction of overall GDP is accounted for by agriculture versus non-agriculture. And you can see again, India, very, very agrarian when you look back in 1983, and remains actually. So it's about close to 40% of overall output was coming from agriculture in 1983. And that number is now down to about 15%. It's actually gone down even further since 2010. And so the non-agriculture's share of overall output has grown very, very quickly in India, and China is the same thing. Once again, this is this structural transformation that I was talking about earlier, that, that there is this gradual moving of resources away from agriculture towards non-agriculture, whether it's people, whether it's capital, yeah.
Was there a big difference between India and China regarding, like, the people who went into the services sector versus manufacturing?
India is somewhat different than China in the, this non-agricultural sector. It's an excellent point. This is a separate, puzzle in some sense, that the standard structural transformation process is people or resources moving from agriculture to manufacturing, and then at another level of development moving from manufacturing to services. India seems to have the transition from manufacturing, from agriculture to manufacturing kind of ended very quickly. So there was some movement, but then it kind of, the biggest transformation has been people moving directly from agriculture into services. And so and China, that was not the case, that it's been the standard thing of agriculture to manufacturing, and then gradually from manufacturing to services. We are seeing much more of that now. But India seems to have jumped a phase, and this is another source of a lot of research interest that people are trying to understand, that, and so divided views. Is this like a sign of problems, that the Indian story is going to die out simply because, manufacturing just never took off? And other people are saying maybe that's what India should be doing, that's where, that's what maybe they have a comparative advantage in doing. And so why bother? If you can buy manufacturing goods, you might as well double down on your services, as long as a lot of those services are, potentially, can generate revenues for you. So as long as services are traded, can be traded, some component of it, you can then buy the rest through importing. So there's that sort of story that's Some people, there's a debate going on about like, can this happen? The problem is the scale of the economy. It's not Singapore. It's like a huge, big economy. So we're talking again of 300 million people. So it's not exactly a small group that you're thinking about specializing in services. Because when people think of services in India, we often think of this high-tech services, the IT sector services. But that's not where the majority of the service sector employment is in India. So the employment share, the Indian employment service sector, development is somewhat, it's a very, how should I go? It's a bimodal kind of thing that most agricultural service sector employment is coming out of very low-skill services. That's the situation in India. These are mom-and-pop outfits sitting, selling fruits by the roadside, selling, working in little, eateries by the roadside, fixing, bicycles and so on and so forth. So that's the majority of household services are like that. While majority of the service sector, output share comes from like 3 or 4 cities in India, which is this IT stuff. What is that saying? That the guys who are producing the big GDP component of services, that sector doesn't really employ that many people. But where the huge part of service sector employment is where not much output's being produced. It's very low productivity. So it's like a very, very bimodal kind of distribution, which is not the way typically people think of services. So that's another issue about how sustainable is this Indian service-led kind of transition. You had a question here?
Yeah, I was thinking the story is more like it's like a WTO thing, right? China went like 2001 or 2008, something like that, right? So China was not in equilibrium. India was, and so then snap of a finger, China wasn't. Therefore, equilibrium broken, and there's a jump, and you're just observing the jump. You look at the time periods, right? So does that make sense?
I'll just say 2 ways that, both these economies have been in a, the definition of equilibrium is somewhat difficult. So in some sense, what one may want to think about is you're in some sort of a long-run steady state, and then you kind of switch because you have a new transition. So China's transition really started in the early 1980s towards a new long-run equilibrium. India started in the early 1990s. There was a massive period of great reform. So Chinese trade reforms, et cetera, started in the early 80s. India started in the early 90s. They were a decade behind. So it wasn't as if India there was nothing happening here, and China was where all the action was. Both these economies were going through pretty rapid changes during this period, and it happened starting about in China, as I said, in the early 80s. In India, it started in the early 90s. That's where the changes began. Prior to that, I think it's a fair description to say that these guys were kind of stuck in some sort of an equilibrium. The second sort of common feature of both these economies is that they were both experiencing very sharp productivity increases during this period, and that's the growth part of it. So the productivity change you can see in India, both in agriculture and in non-agriculture. Non-agriculture in particular, that's the red line. That's as labor productivity was growing very, very rapidly, and the blue line looks much flatter simply because, by contrast to the red line, it looks flatter because the scale is being dictated by the red line, so the blue looks relatively flatter. But it's the same pattern in both these economies that sectoral productivity, labor productivity in non-agriculture was rising very, very rapidly. In agriculture too, it was rising, but not quite as fast. But this productivity takeoff in both China and India that was happening. So very similar in that sense. Structural transformation is similar. Sectoral productivity growth, very similar patterns. And along with that was this rapid urbanization of the labor force. So when you look at India's urbanization, you can see this is the population, the urban population share is in blue, the urban employment share is in red. So both of those were increasing quite rapidly, both in China and India, both the left panel and the right panel. These urban shares of population and employment were rising, and that's this urbanization phenomenon. that, anybody who's lived in these countries will be seeing it. And this is not just China and India. Pretty much most developing countries have exactly this thing. That's why it's so much of development economics tries to understand migration patterns as to, what takes people from rural to urban areas, what kinds of factors drive that. And so these guys are poster, examples of precisely, that sort of phenomenon. Okay, so those are the common features that China and India had lots of similarities in some sense. The experiences were shared, very sort of qualitatively very, very similar. So the question that we want to ask is, could the changes in urban-rural wage gaps be related somehow to these aggregate changes? Okay, so these are very similar changes that are happening in both these countries. Can one start thinking about the relative size of these shocks? Could they be sort of, in some sense, explain what was going on? And the way I want to think of this is that by bringing in a popular story of structural transformation. So most, for those of you who've taken any courses in development economics, at some point there will be some discussion about why do economies go through structural transformations along the growth process. And so the typical story that is told on structural transformation is that there are variants of this. I'll sketch out one particular one, which is probably the most popular one. And so this one says that, look, people need a minimum amount of food for subsistence. Okay, so that's a subsistence requirement of food that you need. Now, in that kind of a world, suppose we are all close to subsistence. Okay, so it's a poor economy. Most people are just scraping by. They're just surviving. And then there is some takeoff in agricultural productivity. That there is an improvement. Maybe there's a green revolution. Maybe there's a technological change. Maybe our irrigation methods improved. We're not so reliant on rain-fed irrigation anymore. So all of those things are better seeds, high-yielding variety of seeds come in. Agricultural productivity rises. When that happens, income increases. Now, when income rises, if we have this kind of minimum, subsistence requirement of food, suddenly as income rises, my, demand for other goods will rise faster than my demand for food. Because food has this, these are called non-homothetic preferences, that I kind of require food to survive. And so once I'm off that minimum base, my additional income I use for other goods. And so what ends up happening is demand, as my income is rising, demand for other goods are rising faster than the demand for food. What does that do? Well, food is going to start becoming relatively cheaper because demand for non-food items are rising faster than demand for food. And so the relative price of food will start falling. Once that happens, people will start leaving agriculture because, if the relative price of food is decreasing, the relative wages in agriculture will also start, because this is all relative to what you can earn in the other sector. The other sector is where the demand is booming, so wages are rising in those sectors, so that starts pulling labor out of agriculture, and so resources begin to flow into the non-agricultural sector as they chase higher real wages. And so along the way, the non-agricultural sector's employment and output share rises. The non-agricultural relative price rises as well because the relative price of agriculture is falling, which is another way of saying the relative price of non-agriculture is actually rising during this process. Okay, so that sounds like a good story. Everybody's been using it. This was the original story of structural transformation that was used in the West because it seemed to fit the pattern in Western Europe, in particular UK, and then in the US in the 19th century. This is exactly the pattern that people saw. So there's been a fair bit of work in economic history that has actually documented this pattern. But there are two problems with this story. In particular, if you start applying it to urban-rural wage gaps, because this story is really about a sectoral story. As you kind of move from agriculture to non-agriculture, what happens to relative price of agriculture, what happens to the relative wages of agriculture, and so on. That's what that story is telling us. But once you start mapping it to urban-rural disparities, this particular story runs into a bit of an issue. The first issue is that given that agriculture is mostly rural, and industry is mostly urban, if you're going to follow this kind of structural transformation narrative, it has to be that as agricultural wages begin to fall, average rural wages will start going down. While the non-agricultural sector is where the relative wages are rising. And so that's the non-agricultural tends to be primarily urban. So urban average wages will start rising. So urban-rural wage disparities will start widening. Okay? Just sort of what we saw in the case of China, but it's the opposite case in India. It's been shrinking. So that's a counterfactual implication, at least from the perspective of India. The second issue is that it basically says that there should be a decline in the relative price of agricultural goods. Okay, that's the story. The story really works off the fact that there is a agricultural productivity breakthrough, so there's an excess supply of the agricultural good, which pushes down the relative price. If you look at the data on relative price of agriculture, this is the relative price of non-agriculture to agriculture in India and in China. Well, basically, the non-agricultural good has been becoming cheaper both in India and in China during this entire period. So it is not the case that agricultural relative prices have been falling. In fact, it's been the opposite. Relative price of agriculture has been rising both in India and in China, which makes this whole story, the traditional story of structural transformation, somewhat problematic because it doesn't quite fit this. Because the key feature that sort of generates all the dynamics is this relative price movement. But if this relative price movement isn't happening, if the agricultural good is becoming more expensive, relatively speaking, then the driver doesn't work. And so then we need some other engine in some sense. So this story is running into two problems. One is in terms of the sectoral price information. And the second one is when you start mapping the sectoral dynamics into urban versus rural, it has this implication that if it's this traditional story, then urban-rural wage gaps should always be widening, and we see the opposite. Okay, so we're sort of we're at this impasse a little bit to try and how do we try to make sense of this? So the basic problem is as follows. So if you think of just a very simple think of there is urban and there is rural labor. So I'm plotting the relative urban to rural labor on the x-axis. That's LU divided by LR. U for urban, R for rural. So it's the relative urban to rural labor. And on the y-axis, I'm plotting the relative urban to rural wage. Okay, so it's like a standard demand-supply plot that I'm trying to do. So what this is saying is, let's say there is some relative urban supplies, labor supply. It could be urban labor force could be 30% of the overall, could be 40% of the overall. So the first picture that I've drawn over here is that it's completely vertical. So in other words, there is no movement between urban and rural workers. It's all between urban and rural areas. The relative urban to rural labor supply is a given. It's a constant. So people are, labor stays where it is. Okay, so that would be a vertical relative urban labor supply schedule. And then there is this downward sloping urban relative demand schedule. Okay, now, so this is downward sloping because the higher the relative urban wage, the lower is going to be the relative demand for urban labor. Okay, so the question then, what this picture is trying to say is, suppose there is a increase in agricultural productivity. Well, what does increased productivity do? It reduces the demand for labor. You don't need as many people to produce the same good, the same amount as you could before. That's what a productivity improvement is. So the moment there is an agricultural productivity breakthrough, demand for agricultural labor goes down because you don't need that many guys. Once you don't need those many people, relative demand for rural labor is going down, which is another way of saying that relative demand for urban labor is going up. It's a relative is one divided by the other. So if the demand for rural labor is coming down, the relative demand for urban labor is going up. And that's that rightward shift. So the new, after the agricultural productivity breakthrough, the relative urban labor demand schedule is shifting out to the right. Yeah? Does that make sense? It's just a simple way of putting things in perspective. So now what would happen? Just based on that, this is like Econ 1, you suddenly have an increased relative urban demand for labor, and you have the same relative urban supply of labor, so the relative urban wage is going to rise. Okay? And that's that widening wage premium, okay, that you see. And that's the standard story that pops out anytime you start writing down. Once you start thinking about the standard story of structural transformation, it has this kind of prospect. Now, of course, you can say that, well, maybe we see migration to urban areas all the time. So maybe this urban relative supply schedule, labor supply schedule, is not totally vertical. As the urban wage premium starts rising, you might be able to induce more people to move. So maybe it's an upward sloping schedule. It's not completely inelastic. There is some elasticity to it. So you can play with that slope. I'm not going to do that because you can draw this picture. In many ways, you should be able to convince yourself that unless the best case scenario is where this relative urban labor supply schedule is completely elastic, in which case it would be completely flat. And in that case, a change in the relative urban labor demand will leave the relative urban wage unchanged. That's the best that you can do. Okay? So I'm just going to leave it as is, saying that that's not going to be a story. The playing with the slope is not going to be, generating any wage convergence at all between urban and rural areas. So I need to do something else. And so here is the fix. Somehow, if I could shift the urban relative labor supply schedule to the right enough, I could there could be a wage convergence that could happen. Urban-rural wage gaps could shrink. And so then the question is, what kinds of factors could cause this whole relative urban labor supply schedule not to be, upward sloping, but actually to shift to the right? In other words, that at each given urban-rural wage gap, there would be more people moving to the urban area. That's what would be needed. And so the question, when you see that, it shouldn't be, amongst all the reasons why a relative urban labor supply schedule could be shifting to the right, is if the cost of migration went down. Okay, so that would be one reason why the schedule could shift. You could think of other reasons as well. So at any point in time, there are many reasons why people don't move. I know the wage in the urban area is high, but it's expensive for me to shift, to back up my rural establishment and move to the urban. The disruption is massive. So, when would I be more willing to make that move? Well, if somehow the cost of transition was lower. Okay, so if I had more information, for example. So one of the problems is I kind of know, but when I go to the urban area, where am I going to stay? I don't have any networks. There is no social safety net. I'm giving up a heck of a lot. There's a lot of uncertainty. But the more the information flows, come to me, I'm more willing to make the move. Moreover, for the same given cost, if the cost of moving is not changing at the same rate as overall prices, the relative price of moving is going to be going down. And that's a testable hypothesis as well. So either which way, the main thing to take away from this picture is that if that relative urban labor supply schedule shifted out far enough to the right, you could get it. And so now you could almost contrast two economies, one where the schedule doesn't shift too much, while the other where it shifts a lot. Then you could end up with the same productivity breakthrough. You could end up with one economy experiencing a wage convergence and another economy experiencing a wage divergence. That's what the model's going to do. So this is like the intuition. I'm not going to bother you too much with the details of the model, but essentially there are two forces. I'm going to write down a model where there are going to be two forces here. The increase in agricultural productivity is going to be a key driver here, but it's going to deliver the structural transformation. But that is by itself going to cause the wage gap to start widening, and it's going to start pushing the agricultural relative price down. But there's going to also, it's going to let loose a process of, increasing relative urban labor supply, which is going to start driving down the urban wage. And so those two shocks together, I'm going to ask, can they explain what we've seen in the data? And so that's where we're going to sort of try and see, a model is going to try and help us to understand if it can explain it. Yeah.
Just to clarify, if manufacturing productivity increases, then the demand curve might shift down as well.
So that would always, so you can have a different driver, which we actually will have in the model, that if the relative growth of non-agricultural productivity, manufacturing productivity is higher, so it's growing faster, there's a pure supply side effect that's going to be pushing down, right? I mean, one sector's output is rising faster than the other sector's output. So even without any non-homotheticity, that's going to drive this effect that it's like if apple supply is rising faster than orange supply, the relative price of apples, is basically going to start falling. And so that's another, so we're going to have that mechanism in there as well. So that's an excellent point. Okay, so we're going to we write down basically a two-period overlapping generations model with two sectors. They're going to be agriculture and non-agriculture. There are going to be two locations, a rural location and an urban location. Both locations can conceivably produce both goods. They're just going to have different productivities in producing the two goods. So the rural area is going to be much more productive in producing the agricultural good. The urban area is going to be much more productive in producing the non-agricultural good. Labor is going to be mobile across both sectors, agriculture, non-agriculture, and it's going to be mobile across locations. But both movements are expensive. When people are born, their labor can be used as is in the agricultural sector. If they want to work in the non-agricultural sector, there is some training that has to be done, which is expensive. So they have to pay a cost to pick up the skills to work in the non-agricultural sector. And if you want to switch your location, you were born in location A and you want to work in location B, that's a switching cost, a migration cost, which is over and above the cost of all other occupational switches. So both these movements are going to be costly. Okay, and so now there's some details of which is just trying to write down. I won't get into this the big thing. The key part I want to say is that there's going to be some preferences here where there's going to be one piece which is you're born at date T. Suppose you're born in location I and you decide to work in location J at date. So you're born at date T in location I and you want to work in location J at date T plus 1. So your lifetime utility is going to be this Vij based on your date of birth. You get some utility from consumption of the good at date T plus 1. And there's also going to be some location-specific welfare you get. So I prefer to be in Vancouver and not in Yellowknife. I mean, so that's because there is some locational amenity that I like. And so each location has its own amenity, which is, I'm calling it epsilon, which is the amenity variable. And so the amenity variable I'm going to describe in just a second. This consumption aggregator, this Cij, has two components, two goods in it. There's an agricultural good and a non-agricultural good. They combine together, and I produce a good that I consume. Call it a person who's living in Vancouver, his consumption good is going to be this combination of all the goods that this person consumes. We are collapsing it down into two kinds of goods. And this minus A bar and plus N bar, this is where we're sort of putting in this, what is known as non-homotheticity. So you can shut down the N bar. The usual way to do this is just put in a minus A bar. So that's the subsistence consumption, that you need a minimum of A bar in order to survive, without which your utility goes to zero. So in other words, you die if you don't at least consume A bar. So up until the point that you're consuming A bar, you're spending all your income on the agricultural good, and beyond that, you start buying other goods. So that's the preference and the amenity. I'm going to sort of also assume that amenities have this aspect that there is a congestion externality. So what ends up happening, the amenity that I enjoy in location J, this epsilon J, has this a fundamental, a constant, a location-specific number epsilon bar and then a variable thing which depends on how many people are coming in relative to how many locals were there to start with. Okay, so MJ are the number of migrants into location J at date T, and LJJ is basically a number of people who are living in location J who were also born in location J. Okay, and so the way it's been written is that this little term E is going to be 1 plus this MJ, migrants divided by the locals. So the larger is the share of migrants as a share of the locals. Your E, the amenity that you're going to get from this place, is going to be changing. Whether that's going to be a positive effect or a negative effect of migrants is going to be a function of this parameter phi. So whether migrants are bringing positive externalities to the place or negative externalities to the place will depend on whether phi is positive or negative. So if phi is negative, the greater the share of migrants, the more the infrastructure is getting completely wiped out. There's not enough for people. Schooling is not provided. Housing is not there. So that's where your amenities are decreasing and you don't like it. On the other hand, if phi is positive, migrants are bringing something else. And so this is a number we're going to estimate, this parameter, to see, for the two countries. Okay, and the production functions are going to be very, very simple. It's going to be linear in productivity. Each sector, the agricultural sector, can be, agricultural good can be produced in both rural and urban. J is the location, so it can be produced in both places, but it has its own location-specific productivity. So you can imagine agriculture being extremely unproductive in urban areas, in which case this A superscript U is going to be very low. Yeah, and the same token, non-agriculture can be extremely productive in urban areas and very, unproductive in rural areas. And that way, the way we're going to get that is both through these levels of productivities as well as through these parameters, alphas and betas. So those are all location-specific and sector-specific. Okay, there's some standard stuff that goes on. So let me just, tell you the basic takeaways, what the model is going to bring you. And so I've already described, in some sense, what the model's main implications are. Essentially, anytime there's an increase in productivity, what this model is going to do is that it's going to deliver structural transformation. Okay? But the structural transformation, as resources move from agriculture to non-agriculture, it's going to come with rising non-agricultural prices, decreasing relative price of agriculture, which, as I've told you earlier, is a counterfactual, doesn't quite bear the facts in China and India. It was true for the UK and the US and parts of Western Europe in the late 19th century, early 20th century. It doesn't seem to hold for China and India. So it tends to widen the wage gap between urban and rural areas. But the increase in productivity also induces migration from rural to urban areas, partly because the cost of migration is going to be rising less than proportionately with the increase in output. So the relative cost of migration is falling. So for any given urban-rural wage gap, more people are going to be moving. Because that's what's going to happen. That's that outrightward shift of the relative labor supply function that's going to happen. And so as that urbanization effect kicks in, as the stronger it gets, it's going to start pushing down the non-agricultural price because the urban production is rising, which is disproportionately of the non-agricultural good. So the non-agricultural good supply is increasing relatively faster. So that's going to start pushing down, along with the effect that you talked about, but this is an independent thing that's going to drive an increased relative supply of the non-agricultural good. It's going to start pushing down the price. And so the question then is, it has these two effects that are drawn in the picture. The question is that, can we distinguish between China and India when we estimate the model? When we calibrate the model, we take it to the data, can the model distinguish between China and India based on what it's identifying through the data? That's going to be the question. Yeah?
Can you over again, why does increase in productivity increase the cost of migration, right? Because you can think about, let's say, increase productivity, everyone becomes rich, and like the house prices become unaffordable.
Yeah.
So with this logic, then it will be
Yeah. So
migration.
no, absolutely excellent point. Essentially, if you want to think about it, that let's say the cost of moving is, let's say, C. Okay, some saw. So that's the cost of moving, and then there is, there's output, which is also growing. So the relative cost of moving is C divided by Y. Okay, so Y is rising if C does not rise proportionately. That's the key assumption that we have, that in our model, this is a fixed cost, but in general, you don't need it to be a fixed cost. As long as it doesn't rise as fast as the increase in Y, you will still get a reduction in the relative cost. It doesn't hold exactly for all places that you might think of, precisely for the reason you were talking about, that at some point, these congestion externalities become too much. And so when that kicks in, and that's going to be part of the estimating of these parameters, if the parameter estimates are such that, for example, the fee becomes incredibly negative, it's going to swamp all of this, where nobody will want to move. And so that's going to be part of how we're going to try and distinguish between these two, China and India. It's an excellent point. Okay, so that's what we're going to try and do. We have a model. I mean, there's a whole lot of machinery, behind. And so we are now going to try and calibrate that thing using all the data that we can find. And then we're going to sort of let this whole machinery rip and see if the estimated model can distinguish between what we saw for China and what we saw for India. So how are we going to do this? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to calibrate the full model to match the key data moments that we care about for China and India individually for 1983 and 1988. Then we're going to keep whatever parameters we calibrated to match those initial period moments. We're going to fix those parameters. We're not going to change them anymore. And the only thing we're going to hit the model with is the measured productivity change, the sectoral productivity change that we measure from the data. We're just going to push that into the model and then resolve the wage gaps and the sectoral employment gaps that come out from a different productivity once you put the productivity shocks in. And then we're going to see, does it predict wage convergence or wage divergence for China and India individually? That's the exercise. Okay, so this has now almost become a bit of a engineering science here in model solving, and I won't bother you with that. The only thing the red bar, the red encircled thing that I've put down is basically telling you this migration cost. As you can see, the fee parameter, this externality of migration, is negative for both, but look at India, it's like minus 0.02. That's what it comes out. For China, it's much bigger. It's minus 0.16. So in other words, there are much stronger negative externalities from people moving, from migrants moving to urban areas in China. And similarly with the tau, which is the actual cost. I called it C, that's really tau. That is also estimated to be much higher for China than for India. So migration costs in general are lower. That's one thing to take away. We're going to put in the productivity, measured changes in labor productivity that we saw in India and China for each sector. We're going to feed those in. This is what we've seen between in 1983 and 2010. In India, agricultural productivity rose 67%. Non-agricultural productivity rose 200%. That's what we're going to feed in into the model. And then we're going to do the same thing for China. Clearly, China's productivity growth was way greater in both sectors than India's. Okay, so, and that's going to be one counterfactual exercise we're going to do. Okay, so now, after having done all of this, here is the sort of the dessert in some sense at the end of it. So this is the table that's telling me, remember 1988, we were trying to match the model moments to the data moments, okay? So what were our key, main things of interest? So clearly we were interested in the wage gaps, okay? We are interested in the employment gaps, that, what share of the population, of the workforce is in agriculture versus in non-agriculture, in rural areas and in urban areas. So if you look at the data column and the model column, it pretty much, lines up. For 1988, the numbers are pretty much the same. The only moment we didn't target was the overall mean wage gap. Okay, we targeted the within agriculture, urban-rural wage gap, within non-agriculture, urban-rural wage gap. We targeted rural wage gaps, sectoral wage gaps in rural areas, non-agriculture to agriculture, sectoral wage gaps in urban areas, non-agriculture to agriculture. We targeted all of those, and so it's lining up. And so, no surprise, the overall wage gap is actually, it's not a targeted moment, but it's kind of holding pretty well. For China, it's sort of working out quite okay. Okay, and so then the next question is, when you hit this same model now with the changed productivity for agriculture, non-agriculture for China, and resolve the model, what does it predict for all these sectoral wage gaps and sectoral employment gaps? And the main takeaway that I want you to sort of just focus on the overall mean, and you can see for China, the mean wage premium rises from 64%, goes to about 70% by, in response to the overall productivity changes, and the rest of it is kind of lining up okay. You look at India, exact same exercise, calibrate to 1983. We are hitting pretty much everything in 1983, but that's what we were targeting, so no surprise, we are hitting it reasonably well. But then look at what happens once we hit the same model now with the measured productivity changes in agriculture and non-agriculture in India, and you see that the 64% wage premium shrinks in India to 34% in response, just resolving that same model. Remember, for 2010, we're not targeting anything. Those are all just the only thing that has changed relative to 1983 is that we've just hit it with measured productivity changes from the data. And that is pretty much generating about 73% of the overall wage convergence that we saw in the data for India. This model actually generates for China and India. And more importantly, or not more important, but an ancillary result is that it also is generating the fact that the relative price of non-agriculture is shrinking, which is exactly what we saw in the data, that relative price of agriculture is rising, which is another way of saying non-agriculture was becoming cheaper. The same thing was happening in China as well. That from relative price of 1, it goes down. So there's an 18% reduction in the relative price of non-agriculture in China. It's a sharper reduction in the case of India. So a priori, the model is explaining what we set out to explain. It's the function of, the key thing is this labor supply, relative urban labor supply change that was that happened. So one can do one. I'm just going to show you one experiment and we'll stop. The question that we want to ask is, suppose the migration costs in China were the same as the migration costs in India. Okay? So suppose, in other words, China had the tau of India. Tau was the migration cost that we estimated for India. Suppose we gave India's tau to China. So that's the migration cost. And then we can ask, how would that change? What would be the impact of that on the wage convergence that we saw? So what would be this counterfactual, relative wage convergence in China as a result? And the big thing that you should see is that in the Chinese case, it's that, the rectangle around in red. Instead of a wage divergence, we would have had a 24% wage convergence in the Chinese case. Instead of seeing the wage divergence that we saw, if I gave China India's migration cost, there would be a wage convergence. So, in other words, the big difference between these two countries is really the cost of migration. So this, of course, should lead to there's other tests of whether the model passes a bunch of other tests as well. So, but I won't bother you with this. I'll just kind of end with this one. The big thing is, so this is what the model's giving me. Is there anything in the ground that can, that I can, what is telling you that, is there any signal from something else that's telling me that migration costs are higher in China? And there is. It's the hukou system. In China, this is the precise period when the hukou systems now they've started relaxing it, but it's like an internal passport system in China. That when you're born, you basically have a hukou belonging to the specific province, and not just the province, whether you're in the rural area or the urban area, you have a rural hukou or an urban hukou. which means, of course, what bite does that hukou have? It's exactly what a passport does. If you end up with a rural hukou, you end up in urban Shanghai, you can not enjoy you have to pay for healthcare. You cannot send your kids to school over there. You can, to public schools you cannot, so you'll have to pay for it. You cannot buy property. So there are huge numbers of restrictions. So in other words, the hukou system is one way of limiting, and China had put that in place precisely because they were worried about this massive migration of people from rural to urban areas was going to completely swamp urban infrastructure, and this was one way of restricting it. And they finally started getting rid of that. In about 2014-15, the hukou system has been progressively being relaxed, precisely because the urban areas are facing shortages. They need more workers, but workers are saying, if I go there, I don't get a lot of public services, I need those. That India has no such restriction. And so it's not that migration is not costly. Migration is costly, but in China there's an extra cost in some sense of moving, which is relative to the productivity differences between rural and urban areas, the wage gaps. Far fewer people were moving in China. And partly that's, it's down to this hukou system. So I'll stop over here. I think it's exactly my time to stop. So
Yeah, okay, everyone, could we please give him a round of applause? Thank you very much. We have around 15 minutes to ask questions, and then we'll have pizza afterwards. So now I'll open the floor to any questions. If you guys have, I'll pass you the mic, and Professor, you can answer them. Does anyone want to go? Yeah, okay, wait. I'm going to run. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, I can hear, yeah.
Oh, it's for the documentation purposes.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Professor. First of all, this was an amazing presentation. I just had one question. So we were looking at models from 1983 to 2008 mostly and comparing it between. In the last, let's say, 17 years or so, from 2008 to 2025, both India and China has gone through like massive urbanization and massive development under like, let's say, Prime Minister Modi or President Xi Jinping, and also like with the relaxation of hukou system, as you said. How would you say it would differ right now if we were supposed to do like this experiment in 2025?
Yeah, so a couple of things have happened. The first is these urban-rural, so I told you we sort of, ran, so let me just take a step back. We stopped in 2010 for India and 2008 because that's the last year we have this unit-level data from NSS, because the Indian, household surveys, they stopped producing this thing, and they've now gone to a periodic labor force survey, which is every year, but it's a non-comparable frame, so we really cannot. And so we tried to stay as close to the Indian last date with the Chinese one as well, 2008. China actually has been producing similar things. So when we looked at the Chinese data for 2015 and 16, this hukou change started coming in 2013-14 is when they started changing it. And so you actually do start seeing some wage convergence creeping in China. Precisely, the urban-rural wage gaps have started shrinking, and exactly as this would predict. In the Indian case, I think this is partly the point you were raising, that urban India has become almost unlivable. I mean, most parts of urban India are just, this complete breakdown of urban infrastructure just because they've been swamped, capacity has been swamped. And, this expansion of the non-agricultural sector has come, and this is partly what we've punted on, by collapsing all the employment in non-agriculture into one sector, as opposed to thinking about manufacturing and services and separating services into low skill and high skill. What has happened in India is that most employment has been in this low skill segment of the service sector, which is, essentially very low wages, no benefits, no job security. So these are people who came in from rural areas chasing a dream, and it's turned into a nightmare for these guys because there are no high wage jobs. So people live on a very, exposed, fraught existence where there is almost no guarantees of anything. And so the whole thing came into stark relief, I think, after COVID, when the shutdown happened. People just started exiting back to their rural villages. They just, because there at least you have your little, you have a plot of land, you share a house. This stuff. But in an urban area, it's 10 unknown guys sharing a room, and a job can be there today and can be gone tomorrow. You're working as a security guard in an agency. The guy gets upset and fires you. So there's almost no, and most of the jobs are gig worker jobs where there's just absolutely, the benefits are zero, wages are very low, and you don't even know if you're going to have the wage tomorrow or not. So it's like so that's partly, if you're poor in India, you're in the last 15 years, what this is telling you is that you're better off being poor. The rural poor are doing better than the urban poor. So what has happened is, and that's in some sense, the migration patterns post-COVID brought that into sharp relief, that where do people see the life being worse? And so it's not so much a hugely good life in rural areas, but urban poor have really had a hard time, and that's where, and the hukou system is kind of, in China it's been going sort of the other way, which is I think where we are. But I would have loved to have done this, with an updated data set, but given that the frames aren't comparable, it's very hard to do it. But, yeah.
Just a follow-up. How do you compare the rural poor and urban poor in China?
So how do I compare what?
Sorry, could you? Rural poor and urban poor in China.
So the Chinese, for at least from the data, I don't know China personally. In India, I have a more personal sense of it. So my sense is that, the rural poor have actually been, improving their lot much, at least in the last 20 years, things have actually started improving, last 15 years, relative to the urban poor. They're both rising. It's not, so this is again a relative statement. It's not as if one was losing, the other was. This is all a statement about whose incomes are rising faster. And so in the last, at least the last 10 years or so, it seems that rural households have been gaining, relative, at least the mean. I mean, the top end always does much better in urban areas. But the mean has been doing, the median has been doing, relatively better.
No, what I was trying to get at more is like you created this story of like it's better to be rural poor than urban poor in India.
Yeah.
But at least from my understanding, if you're in China, like that's not a thing. I think in China the choice is urban poor better than rural poor.
Yeah. No, I think that is true. So this is a statement about, I didn't show you that picture. There is a percentile. I don't know if I have that. Let me see if I have some appendix slides. No, I took it out. Anyway, so, you can plot the wage gap percentile by percentile separately, for 1983 and for 2010. And for India, what you'll see is that the percentile wage gap, the urban to rural wage gap, up until the 20th percentile has turned negative in 2010 in India. In other words, the rural poor are actually, if you look at the 15th percentile of the rural population, of the rural workers, their incomes are greater than the 15th percentile of the urban workers. In China, that is not true. And so that's the sense, and your hunch is right, that it is not the case that the urban poor are doing worse than the rural poor. But in India, that's because, as I said, that percentile wage gap up to the 15th percentile. In China, it's like positive pretty much all through. So the urban poor or the urban middle income and the urban rich are all doing better. But in India, the absolute size of that wage gap has turned negative if you're below the 15th percentile. And that's the sense in which the rural poor are better off than the urban poor in India. But this is in the last, this was not true 20 years ago. This is like true since 2010. This has been true. So it's a bit of a grim thing that you don't want development to sort of create sort of such odd features.
We have time for maybe one more question. I did have a question. specifically about migration and the policies that these like each of these countries involved like were employed. Is there some sort of like endogeneity there between like why for instance China employed the hukou system and India chose not to? Like is it just like China had foresight into the fact that they didn't want to overcrowd, or was there already like the fact that perhaps they faced like high costs already in migration and chose to do that in order to, I don't know.
So yeah, I don't know the exact political economy history of China's hukou system, but what I understand is that there was this concern of getting swamped. So there's a concern about just the size of the population. Has always been there. That was the one-child policy. Also was an outcome of that concern about just too many people. And then when you have urban areas that are struggling to develop infrastructure to facilitate industry, what you don't want is for that thing to get completely swamped. So that was the idea, that if you just have a whole host of people coming in to urban areas. So you kind of see this kind of argument in a lot of developing countries, saying that there's too much migration. That's what people say, that it's like we're getting swamped. You talk to places in India where India hasn't had any such restriction. China also has this ability to impose this simply because it's a different kind of system, which allows it to control individual actions a bit more. In India, you can't do that, but you go to the cities and every, urban, resident will complain about migrants, saying that the reason we are in this state is that every day thousands of people are like arriving into the city and the city just can't keep up. And so that's, I think, generally true everywhere. And so wanting to control that, if, you can control it if you have super control over people. So the hukou system is like saying, I'm going to introduce an internal passport to sort of to make it less exciting for you to go to the city. Otherwise, what ends up happening is that the price system tries to do that for you. That, in other words, it makes life so bad, which is what's been going on for urban poor workers in India, that they're just heading back, saying, that I'm just going to, the price system is kicking in, saying wages are going to be so low that, people will just stop moving after a while, and they'll start going the other way. So you can try to do quantitative restrictions, or else the price system will do it. I mean, it's one of the two. I mean, so, and that's what you're seeing. You're seeing two ends of the spectrum.
So if I could follow up real quick, in terms of like policy implication, then there might be a case to be made that restricting the amount of convergence may in the long run allow for I guess an ease in the amount of like consumption each of these people get in like agricultural and non-agricultural areas?
In China.
In China.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a good case to be made that which is not there in the structure that I showed you, that how much of the infrastructure is sort of how much it contributes to productivity. And so clearly Chinese productivity has been extremely high, and it's very, very well known. But it's also a function of the fact that they've been able to provide state-of-the-art infrastructure. They've been able to build that up very quickly. But it's been done in a very focused and targeted kind of way. It's not generalized rollout of infrastructure, which in some sense, if you didn't have these limits, you would have to do a much more generalized approach. And so maybe this is basically saying a targeted rollout for a country with limited means. Maybe that's, producers get, higher gains. Now, is that good for overall welfare or not? That's a different question. But certainly if you're just targeting to maximize growth, maybe, that's the way to go.
Okay, I think that's about all the time we have for now. Can we all have one more round of applause, please? Thank you very much.